Welcome back to the Combat Athlete Physio YouTube channel, where we take human movement science and we bring it to the combat sports. So first things first, the answers to the last module's quiz questions are going to be in the pinned comment below, so make sure you check those out and see how you did. Other than that, welcome to module 103, where we look at the planes of motion. And when it comes to biomechanics, the planes of motion are foundational but often overlooked. So let's get into lesson 1 of this module. What are the planes of movement? So a plane of movement is essentially just an imaginary surface that slices through the body. And we have 3 main planes of movement. The sagittal plane, which divides the body into right and left halves. The frontal plane, or coronal plane, divides the body into front and back halves. And then the transverse plane, which cuts the body into top and bottom halves. Since the planes of movement are a lot easier to explain and kind of conceptualize visually, I'm going to use the Human Anatomy Atlas app to help us out. So the first plane of movement that we're going to look at is the sagittal plane. And the sagittal plane, remember, a plane is just an imaginary flat surface going through the body. So if you can imagine, the plane is represented by the circle. Don't pay attention to the line for right now. Okay, we'll get there in later modules. But the plane, the sagittal plane, is represented by this circle. And if you can imagine, the circle is a flat surface and it's cutting the body into right and left halves. Okay, so whenever we have a movement like this one called spinal flexion, we can see that the movement is happening along that plane. So the movement moves through the plane of motion. And so I'm going to kind of turn it around so you guys can see just how this happens. So the spinal flexion just starts from a neutral position, that anatomical neutral position, and it's just the spine bending forward. And so we can see that as it moves forward, it moves along the sagittal plane. And it's an imaginary flat line, so if we were to look straight ahead, we actually can't see that plane of movement, since it's a two-dimensional software trying to represent a three-dimensional thing. So this is a pretty good representation of what it looks like for the body to move through the sagittal plane. And the second plane of movement that we're going to look up is the frontal plane, or the coronal plane. And so for this plane of movement, I have pulled up another big trunk movement. It's a little bit easier than looking at kind of the individual smaller joints to visualize planes of movement, especially from this kind of anatomical neutral position that we just learned about in the last module. Okay, so remember, a plane is just an imaginary flat surface cutting the body into halves. And in this case, the frontal plane, I didn't get it exactly right because I hand drew this plane, so forgive me. But you can imagine how this cuts the body into anterior half and a posterior half. Okay, so I'm going to press go, and this is spinal lateral flexion or spinal side bending. And so you can see, again, just kind of ignore this line for right now. That'll be in a later module. But you can see how this movement is moving through that plane. So if this were to be moving forward and backwards, like the sagittal plane, it wouldn't be moving through this plane, which is why it occurs in a different plane. So this is a really good representation of a spinal movement, a big global spinal movement moving through the frontal plane. For the third and final plane of motion, it's admittedly my favorite motion. I think a lot of athleticism is derived from this plane of motion. It's the transverse plane. Okay, so a lot of rotation happens around the transverse plane. So if I press go, we can see that thoracic spine or trunk rotation is happening through this plane of motion. Again, it's an imaginary surface. The transverse plane is the imaginary surface that bisects the body it cuts the body into halves, superior half and an inferior half. Okay, again, ignore this line here, that comes later, but we could see it moving. This is a nice view of it moving through the transverse plane. There you have it. This is a pretty straightforward module. Now let's get into the quiz questions. Question number 1, when you're throwing a left hook, what is the primary plane of movement that your body is moving through? One more time. When you're throwing a left hook, what is the primary plane of movement that your body is moving through? Question number 2, if you're doing a side kick, what is the primary plane of movement that you're moving through? One more time. If you're doing a side kick, what is the primary plane of movement that you're moving through? Question number 3, if you lean back to evade the punch, like Lordzilla is doing here, through what plane of movement is the spine moving? One more time. If you lean back to evade a punch, what is the plane of movement that the spine is moving through? Hopefully this helped you visualize the planes of movement a little bit more clearly. Stay tuned for module 104, where we talk about the axes of rotation. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.